Thank you, everyone, for joining us, or if you're listening again, you must be really interested in parking. So I'm Peter Richards. I'm a director at IBI Group, and I'm a project manager for the Oshawa Parking Study, and this is the Virtual Public Information Center. So thank you for taking time out of your schedule this evening. With me is Attila Hertel. He's a deputy project manager, and Patrick Gorell, who was just speaking. He's a consultation lead. So the event tonight is intended to present the parking study's preliminary conclusions and recommendations and obtain feedback from the public, and this will be used to refine the preliminary conclusions. Next slide talks about the study scope and objectives. The parking study is intended to analyze Oshawa's citywide parking opportunities and needs with a focus on the urban growth center while assessing existing and future downtown parking operations, hearing from and addressing stakeholder and public concerns, creating a citywide parking policy framework, reviewing the city's residential parking requirements, and reviewing financial operations and investigating the potential for cash in lieu of parking program. Next slide talks about the key parking study topics. The Oshawa Parking Study examined several key topics, including public and stakeholder consultation, residential parking requirements, downtown parking operations, and parking financial operations. The public and stakeholder consultation was completed in 2 phases. The first phase was completed in the spring of 2019, and the intention of this phase was to introduce the study, to collect feedback on existing parking operations, any known issues, and to outline the desired study outcomes. Phase 2, which includes this virtual public information center, is being completed to collect feedback about the study's preliminary findings and recommendations. Oshawa's citywide residential requirements were reviewed by examining several sources such as parking supply and demand surveys and parking requirement best practices. An updated parking requirement was recommended if it was considered warranted, and this gets touched on later on in the presentation. Again, some more high-level key parking study topics for this presentation. The health of Oshawa's downtown parking system was examined by reviewing existing parking supply and demand, projecting parking supply and demand, assessing special event parking supply and demand, and fairly allocating the limited curb space. The study examined the financial sustainability of Oshawa's parking finances by reviewing existing parking revenues and expenses, and the cash in lieu program was also evaluated as a tool to fund future parking facilities. A cash in lieu of parking program allows developers to pay a predetermined amount in lieu of meeting the parking zoning bylaw requirements. Now I'll talk about the study process. So the following tasks were completed to develop the preliminary recommendations and conclusions. And this included phase 1, as I mentioned, the phase 1 public and stakeholder consultation. And this consisted of several phases. Public Information Center, number 1, an online survey to the public and stakeholders, and what we're calling an online crowdsourcing parking hotspot map. This allowed the general public to pinpoint specific areas of parking issues that they may have had. And the city also hosted 3 community outreach sessions. So there was a lot of engagement through the spring and summer of last year. The study also looked at existing and future supply and demand analysis, looked at residential parking standards development, financial assessment and cash in lieu of parking, and we completed technical memoranda outlining the study findings, which were reviewed and finalized with Oshawa's Technical Advisory Committee. I'll go over all these points over the course of this presentation. So some of the common phase 1 consultation themes and issues identified included overnight on-street parking being a bit of a challenge in residential neighborhoods. The existing 2 parking spaces per dwelling unit standard that's required is not enough in some residential areas. Downtown on-street parking should offer greater flexibility in duration and payment methods. And another common thing we heard was finding an available on-street parking space in the urban growth center and in some residential neighborhoods can be challenging. And we'll dive into all of these issues right now. So a key thing to do for the study was to develop a vision statement and guiding principles, and they're important pieces of policy that help Oshawa staff in making parking related planning decisions. So the vision statement we developed was parking should be self-sufficient, sustainable, and accessible parking operations are envisioned in the urban growth center, that meet the needs of a rapidly growing city, while promoting alternative modes of transportation. Transportation hubs and intensification corridors parking needs are envisioned to be managed through transit-oriented developments, supported by zoning bylaw requirements tailored to urban environments. And from this stemmed guiding principles. So we developed 10 guiding principles, and they focused on meeting future parking needs, promoting alternative modes of transportation, designing environmentally friendly and aesthetically pleasing parking facilities, and achieving financial sustainability. And here's just a map that shows the areas that were considered: Oshawa Urban Growth Center, transportation hubs, and intensification corridors. And these are all shown on the map here. So downtown Oshawa study area and parking supply. So as of February 2019, the downtown Oshawa parking system, shown here in the dashed line, they provided just over 4,000 parking spaces. And this consisted of a mix of municipal on-street parking, municipal off-street parking, and what's known as publicly accessible private off-street parking. And we surveyed all of these areas to determine how busy they were, what the parking occupancy or utilization was. So the existing parking utilization is a parking industry best practice. So when it comes to parking operations, industry best practices target a maximum utilization or occupancy of about 85 to 90%. And this is the point where drivers begin to experience difficulty in finding an available space. So in downtown Oshawa, within the study area shown here in the dashed line, the system-wide utilization was observed to peak at its busiest time when the most vehicles were in the study area. The busiest it got was 61% of parking spaces were occupied, meaning 39% were available. So some individual parking facilities were observed to operate near capacity, but parking opportunities were always available nearby. So based on these findings, Oshawa's existing parking system is considered sufficient to meet existing parking needs. We then looked at the future parking system in 2031. So parking utilization in Oshawa is expected to grow a little over 70% by 2031. So similar to existing conditions, some users or drivers may experience difficulty in finding a parking space in the more popular locations, but parking opportunities are anticipated to remain available nearby. Therefore, similar conclusion to existing, the future parking supply is projected to be sufficient to meet future parking needs. However, Oshawa is recommended to focus efforts on helping users find an available parking space in a quick and efficient manner, such as developing a parking wayfinding strategy. Note that parking demand forecasts have not been adjusted or reduced to account for any long-term impacts due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And as we recommend for many parking strategies, things change, developments that are on the books don't go through, population growth may exceed or not be as high as projected, same with employment. So it's recommended that Oshawa monitor these things, and they monitor the parking demand via updated surveys in 2022. This next slide, my optometrist might expect you to read, but it's not for the purposes of digestion during this meeting. It's more so a tool we did for the city, and it's a curbside decision-making framework. So given the limited curbside space and the many competing users, such as parking, transit, cycling, pickup, drop-off, loading, etc., probably about 15 to 20 different users, an efficient and fair method for allocating the limited curb space is needed. This is what Oshawa requested as part of the study. So from that, a curbside decision-making framework was developed to assist Oshawa staff in prioritizing curbside space by user. The overarching comment is to prioritize curbside use or designations based on the street or corridor type, while considering the nearby supply of various curbside users. So as I touched on a few slides ago, because there's things that you can't predict, such as a global pandemic or changes to growth rate and employment, the way to get around that is to provide a parking management plan. In this case, parking supply triggers. So these are thresholds that can be examined and pointed to as these numbers change, and you have a baseline to compare against. So to aid parking management decisions, we developed triggers for these various actions. So the recommended actions were grouped into 3 scenarios. Scenario 1, which is the first row here, this is if the system-wide parking utilization is below 85%, while individual parking facilities may operate near capacity, parking opportunities remain available nearby. In this case, no actions are needed. Scenario 2, system-wide parking utilization is below 85%, but groups of parking facilities are near capacity without available capacity nearby. In this case, a parking supply expansion is not considered necessary, but rather strategies aimed at distributing parking demand to underutilized facilities are considered appropriate. The last scenario is if the system-wide parking utilization is over 85% and there's many localized parking issues observed. In this case, strategies aimed at managing demand are considered appropriate. So if all demand strategies are exhausted, this is when you would look into a parking supply expansion. So you don't want to go and build a parking structure on every block if you can better distribute the demand. So that's essentially what this is saying in terms of when new counts are completed, here are some of the parking triggers and actions that are related. Something else we looked at for a parking management plan was special event parking demand. So Oshawa regularly hosts special events at the Tribute Community Center, and naturally this creates localized peaks in parking demand. So during these special events, on-street parking around the Tribute Community Center was observed to operate near capacity, which is not surprising. However, Parkade 3, which is located a short walk north, was observed to operate with available capacity. So this led to the strategy we've developed for the special events, and it stems down to the general parking policy in the city. Ideally, event goers would park off-street, which would keep on-street parking spaces available for short-term users of the nearby establishments. So the general best practices for on-street parking is that people who are staying for long periods of time somewhere, they should gravitate towards off-street, and it should be priced such that it's cheaper, whereas on-street is premium, high turnover, short-term usage. So to promote event goers to the off-street facilities, the on-street maximum parking duration is recommended to be reduced from 3 hours to 2 hours in the downtown. 2 hours is too short for special event parking needs, but it's still enough time for most short-term users. And this strategy would ideally result in off-street parking for special event goers and on-streets for restaurants and other business users. Some parking policies and regulations we looked at are here in the first column. No major issues were identified when reviewing on-street parking regulations, overnight parking, on-street parking duration, and accessible parking. On-street parking regulations are recommended to be changed as needed to facilitate active transportation, transit, cycling, and streetscape projects. The maximum on-street duration is recommended to be reduced from 3 hours to 2 hours to facilitate a special event plan, as mentioned in the previous slide. This recommended change to metered on-street parking spaces in the downtown is for all the time, not just during special events. Next slide is a parking policy framework development, and a policy framework was developed to help Oshawa staff in updating parking policies and standards. The framework considers the best practices of other municipalities, recommends updates to Oshawa's zoning bylaw parking standards, develops parking strategies that are appropriate for specific locations, and plans for macro level trends such as autonomous vehicles and ride sharing. The policy framework was applied to Oshawa's existing residential parking requirements, and updates were recommended where appropriate. So in general, 2 categories were developed. Intensification areas here on the far right, and this includes urban growth center, transportation hubs and intensification corridors, and then everything else is considered rest of city. Intensification areas parking requirements are generally lower than the rest of the city. This is because intensification areas tend to have higher development densities with a higher use of alternative modes of transportation. These trends naturally result in lower parking demand. And splitting up parking standards based on intensification areas and rest of city. This is a common industry trend and best practice to not have a citywide blanket rate, and this reflects the varying demand in certain areas or hubs. So other cities that have some geographic specific rates include Toronto, Vaughan, and Burlington, just to name a few. So this slide and the next slide outlines the recommended requirements for various residential land uses, which I'm not going to go over row by row. But you can see them on the slides here, and this presentation is available for download on the Connect Oshawa website. In addition to the number of parking spaces, the garage dimensions of private residences were also examined. Based on the best practices review and the feedback received from the public, Oshawa is recommended to increase private garage dimensions to a length of 6.2 meters and a width of 3 meters. And this is an increase from the current 5.75 meters in length and 3 meters in width. So the width remains the same, and the length increases from 5.75 to 6.2 for garage dimensions. For exemption zones, what a parking exemption zone is, they're intended to promote new development in target areas by providing developers an exemption from the parking requirements. This zone currently exists in Oshawa and shown here in the red line on the map. Given that no parking supply issues are projected within the 2031 horizon, the exemption zone can be supported by the municipal parking system and no changes are recommended. I lost my mouse cursor, there we go. Next slide talks about transportation demand management. And transportation demand management strategies aim at influencing travel behavior by improving and promoting modes of transportation alternative to single occupancy vehicles, such as transit, cycling, and walking. So this study identified 5 strategies developers could adopt to manage the parking demand generated by development, and these include bicycle parking, car share, shared parking, unbundled parking, and off-site parking. To further drill down to bicycle parking requirement, to support cycling as a mode of transportation, the parking study developed bicycle parking requirements for various types of land uses. And similar to vehicle parking requirements, bicycle parking requirements were grouped into intensification areas and rest of city. In general, bicycle parking requirements are higher in intensification areas where the cycling mode share is expected to be higher than in the more rural areas of the city. This next slide is a catch-all for 3 different policies or pricing components: parking price, free parking, and paid parking fine comparison. So to provide an indication towards the appropriateness of Oshawa's existing practices, Oshawa parking prices, free or unpaid parking hours, and parking fines were all compared to the practices of similar municipalities. The review concluded that Oshawa's hourly parking prices are slightly lower than the market rate, while the daily maximum was slightly higher. So Oshawa's parking finances are examined in greater detail in the upcoming slides. With regards to Oshawa's free parking hours and parking fines, they're generally in line with the comparator municipalities. So given that issues that were identified by the public or stakeholders, the existing practices are recommended to be maintained. This slide touches on the historical financial performance. So to evaluate the financial health of Oshawa's parking operations, the parking revenues and expenses between 2014 and 2018 were reviewed. The review determined that overall, the collected revenues were sufficient to fund parking expenses. However, expenditures surpassed revenues in 2015, 16, and 17 due to significant capital parking improvements. If it were not for the surplus in 2014, it is expected that the parking system would have operated at a loss due to large investments in capital projects. So with the objective of achieving an affordable yet financially sustainable parking system, which aligns with the guiding principles, the financial performance of 5 parking price scenarios were projected to 2031 horizon year. So to achieve financial sustainability, Oshawa is recommended to adopt what we call scenario 2, which includes a 10% increase in permit prices and a 25% increase in hourly parking prices, and this is every 5 years, and these are generally in line with inflation. Something else that was examined, as noted, is cash in lieu of parking program feasibility. So with the objective of generating additional funding for future parking supply expansions, the feasibility of cash in lieu of parking program was investigated. So cash in lieu parking grants developers an exemption from meeting the parking requirement in exchange for a payment, which in theory is then used to construct municipal parking facilities to supplement the exempt spaces. The review determined that cash in lieu of parking revenues are not anticipated to be sufficient to fund a newly structured parking facility. Therefore, cash in lieu of parking program is not considered feasible. Oops. And now the final slide are the next steps after today's meeting. So we have to complete phase 2 of the public and stakeholder consultation, and this included activities, several of which have already been completed. This is a meeting with the Development Services and Community Services, Virtual Public Information Center 2, which is what's happening right now, an online public survey, which will share the URL after this presentation and is live until October 29th. So for the next 2 weeks, it's a simple multiple choice to really weigh your opinions on the various preliminary findings. And then a meeting with other stakeholder groups, including but not limited to building industry liaison team and Durham Region home builders. And these meetings actually happen this afternoon. After all this, we're going to take all the feedback from the surveys and summarize the findings of all public and stakeholder consultation activities. We are going to finalize the study conclusions and recommendations in the draft study report, finalize this report, and then we'll bring the study findings and recommendations to Oshawa Council, and we're slated for the end of the year is a current schedule.